In recent days, many commentators or media commentators have asked the question about the current fiscal deficit. They say, for all of the periods since the financial crisis, the coalition has been criticising the Labor Party for their deficit spending during the period, and argued that it was as unhelpful, and much of it was wasteful. So what's different about the coalition's fiscal deficits now? Today, what I want to do is look at that problem and take into account significant research that was done by the International Monetary Fund and published by the International Monetary Fund 5 years after the financial crisis, and it was published in 2013. And the paper that I'm going to look at was called Growth Forecast Errors and Fiscal Multipliers, and it's by Olivier Blanchard and Daniel Lee. Olivier Blanchard was the long-term chief economist of the International Monetary Fund from just before the financial crisis for a long period afterwards. He held the position of chief economist of the International Monetary Fund for longer than anyone since the 1970s. Daniel Lee was also a researcher at the International Monetary Fund. In discussing this paper, I want to start by defining two concepts. One is the fiscal multiplier, and the other one is the zero bound, because both of these concepts are really important in the paper by Blanchard and Lee. Fiscal multiplier is the bang for the buck that you get from deficit spending. If you increase your deficit by 1% of GDP and you get an increase in GDP of 1, then of 1%, that's a fiscal multiplier of 1. If, on the other hand, you increase your deficit spending by 1% and only get an increase in GDP of 0.5%, that is a fiscal multiplier of 0.5. And the reason that we have those low areas, those low levels of multipliers, is because of crowding out. And we'll come back to that in a moment. The other concept that I want to define is the zero bound. Now, RBA Governor Philip Lowe, in a speech last November to the Australian business economists in Sydney, defined the zero bound in Australia as a cash rate of 0.25%. And below that, you couldn't cut interest rates any further in Australia. Okay, so that's as low as you can go. That's close enough to zero. What that does when you've got interest rates at zero, it tells you in Australia or in the US or in the UK that you've arrived at a point of the liquidity trap. And the liquidity trap happens when you can't cut interest rates any further to generate an increase in investment. You can't cut bond yields any further to generate higher levels of investment. Now, with those two definitions in mind, let's turn to the paper by Blanchard and Lee, which was published first by the International Monetary Fund as a working paper, but was published in academic journals again later on. What Blanchard and Lee say is that if you look at the fiscal multipliers that occurred in developed economies before the financial crisis, that on average they found in their calculations of the data of that period that the fiscal multiplier was 0.5. That is to say, for each 1% increase in deficit, in spending in terms of GDP, the effect on the economy was only an increase of half of that, 0.5. Now, why does that happen? Why doesn't all of the deficit spending go through to increase in GDP. The reason that it doesn't is what an economist has called crowding out, that the increased demand or the increased spending at a government level crowds out investment that might be made in the private sector. For example, in Australia, in the financial crisis, we never got to the zero bound, the lower level of interest rates, the lower level of cash rate that we got to in the financial crisis was 3%. And what happened after the financial crisis is that interest rates went from 3% up to 4.75% in response to increased stimulus from the wider deficit. So that's a circumstance of crowding out. Okay. What did Blanchard and Lee find about most developed economies in the financial crisis? Particularly in Europe, but also in the United States and the UK, they found those countries were operating at the zero bound. That is to say, interest rates were as low as they could be cut. And so further cuts in interest rates were impossible. And in that circumstance, you were in a liquidity trap. And in those circumstances, what they found was that increases in deficit spending had an effect on GDP of actually a touch over 1. It was about 1.09. And what that means was that increase of deficit spending by countries which were at the zero bound in the financial crisis had the result of a very good bang for the buck for that deficit spending, that $1 of deficit spending by a country like the US or a country in Europe or the United Kingdom had the effect of $1 of extra output. So that was pretty good value for money. But they also show on page 10 of their report that there was another group of countries, and that group of countries included Australia, Hong Kong, Israel, Korea, New Zealand, Singapore, and the Taiwan province of China. And they observed that in those countries that monetary policy was not at the zero bound, and therefore there was no liquidity trap. And as a result of that, they found that the fiscal multiplier for those countries was 0.5. For example, in Australia at the time, what that means was that for every dollar we were spending by increasing our deficits, that it only generated as a 0.5%, half of that in an increase in GDP. So, but we still had to, even though we were only getting 50 cents back in GDP for every dollar we spent in deficit, we still had to pay back the debt for borrowing the dollar, and we still are paying back the debt for borrowing those dollars. And as I observed, one of the major effects of that deficit spending in Australia at that time was to push interest rates up and crowd out activity in the private sector. How is that different from now? Now, the Australian cash rate is at 0.25%, where the RBA defines a zero bound. At that point, we are definitely at the point of the liquidity trap. In order to provide additional liquidity at the market, the RBA cannot cut rates any further and is involving itself in quantitative easing. But what's the circumstance then? What fiscal multiplier can we expect? Like other countries that were actually at the zero bound in the financial crisis, we can now expect a significantly larger fiscal multiplier than we previously had. Instead of a fiscal multiplier of 50 cents in the dollar, we can expect an output in GDP of $1 or better in terms of GDP. That is to say, our bang for the buck for fiscal spending now is twice as large or more than it was in the GFC. And that means that when we come out of this slowdown, the kick to the economy is going to be much faster than it was for the GFC. So those who criticise the current deficit spending and say that it's like the GFC don't know their economics. They don't know about the very considerable work that was done by analysing fiscal spending in the GFC, especially by the International Monetary Fund. The reality is that we are getting a very strong bang for the buck for our fiscal deficit now. It's at least twice as large as the bang for the buck we got in the GFC, and that generates a much stronger recovery from the Australian economy as we come out of this slowdown.